The pen felt heavy in my hand, not because of its weight, but because of the words it was about to ratify. The lawyer's office was quiet, insulated from the sounds of downtown Cleveland by thick glass and thicker mahogany walls. It smelled of old paper and leather, a scent I always associated with my husband, Richard. But Richard wasn't here. Sarah Jenkins, my friend from a lifetime ago, watched me from across the desk. Her expression was a careful blend of professional concern and personal worry. "Are you absolutely sure about this, Ellie?" she asked, her voice soft. "Once you sign these, there's no going back. You understand that, right?" I looked down at the stack of documents. They were filled with legal jargon, complex clauses, and numbers that represented a life's work. My life's work, in a way. The one I had built in secret. In the quiet hours after the house was asleep, I met Sarah's gaze, and for a moment, the mask of the gentle, unassuming housewife slipped. My hand was steady as I signed my name on the final page. The signature wasn't the shaky script of a grieving woman. It was firm, deliberate. Promise. "It's the only way, Sarah," I said, my voice clear and even. "It's the only way to protect him." She nodded slowly, gathering the papers. "The accounts are set up. Everything is in place, just as you instructed." I stood up, smoothing the front of my simple black dress. "Thank you." That was 3 weeks ago, before the world ended, before the phone call in the middle of the night that stole the air from my lungs. Today, I was just a widow, a ghost in a life that was no longer mine. The November air in Maple Creek, Ohio, was cold and damp, biting at the exposed skin on my hands and neck. It was a day for endings. The sky was a uniform, unforgiving gray, mirroring the granite of Richard's headstone. I stood by the graveside, a black veil shielding my face, though there was nothing left to hide. The tears had dried up days ago, replaced by a hollow ache that seemed to have settled permanently in my bones. My son, Leo, stood beside me, at 29. He looked like a younger, softer version of his father, but without the unshakable confidence that had been Richard's armor. He wore an expensive suit that seemed a size too tight, constricting him. His jaw was clenched, his eyes fixed on the polished mahogany casket being lowered into the earth. I knew he wasn't just mourning his father. He was mourning the giant whose shadow he'd lived in his entire life. On his other side was Jessica, his girlfriend. She was beautiful, sharp, and ambitious. She held Leo's arm, not in a gesture of comfort, but of ownership. Her eyes, whenever they flickered toward me, were not filled with sympathy. They were calculating, assessing. She was surveying her new kingdom. People murmured their condolences. He was a great man. Ellie, a pillar of the community. Richard will be missed. I nodded and accepted their words. These polite, meaningless phrases. They saw Richard Vance, the successful construction mogul who had built half of this wealthy suburb. They saw his perfect wife and his handsome son. They saw the American dream, etched in stone and displayed in our sprawling colonial home. They didn't see the truth. They didn't see the silent, suffocating pressure that held our perfect family together. Richard was a king, and our home was his castle. He was a good man in his own way. He provided, he protected, and he loved us with a fierce, possessive love that left little room for anyone else to breathe. He made every decision, from the stocks he invested in to the color I painted the guest bathroom. I had accepted my role as the quiet queen consort, the manager of his perfect home, the keeper of his perfect life. It was a comfortable cage, gilded and secure. I had forgotten, over 30 years, what it felt like to fly. After the service, we returned to the house. It was filled with people I barely knew, business associates of Richard's, neighbors we waved to across manicured lawns. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and catered food. I moved through the rooms like a phantom, my hand automatically reaching out to straighten a picture frame, to pick up an empty glass. These were the motions of my life, the small tasks that had filled my days. Leo was holding court in the living room, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He was trying to be his father, accepting handshakes and solemn nods with a gravity that didn't sit right on his shoulders. Jessica was beside him, a hand on his back, guiding him, whispering in his ear. I watched them from the doorway. He was lost, and she was leading him down a path I feared he was not prepared for. I saw her lean in and murmur something. Leo glanced over at me, his expression hardening for just a fraction of a second before he turned away. Chill, colder than the November wind, snaked down my spine. Something was wrong. The foundation of my world had already cracked with Richard's death. Now, I felt the ground beneath my feet begin to crumble. I escaped to Richard's study. It was the one room in the house that was entirely his. Dark wood paneling, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound classics he'd never read, and a massive oak desk that dominated the space. The air still held the faint, familiar scent of his cologne and cigars. I ran my hand over the back of his leather chair, the one he had sat in every night to go over ledgers and blueprints. This was where he had ruled, and this was where I had learned to be invisible. He would work for hours, and I would sit in the armchair by the window, reading a book, my presence a quiet, comforting hum in the background of his busy life. He liked having me there. He said it helped him think. I think it just reminded him that everything was in its proper place, including me. I remember one night, years ago, Leo was in high school, struggling with calculus. Richard had tried to help, his voice booming with impatience as Leo grew more and more frustrated. It's simple logic. Son, you're just not applying yourself. Leo finally threw his pencil down and stormed out. I found him in his room, his face buried in his pillow. I'll never be like him. He choked out. I'm not smart enough. I'm not good enough. I had tried to comfort him, telling him that his father loved him, that he just wanted the best for him. But even then, I knew that Richard's love was a heavy burden. It came with expectations that were impossible to meet. He wanted Leo to be a mirror image of himself, but he had never bothered to look at the son he actually had. My mind drifted back further, to a life before Richard. A life where I was Eleanor Bennett, top of my accounting class at Ohio State, with a job offer from one of the biggest firms in Chicago. I had a mind for numbers, a knack for seeing patterns that others missed. Sarah and I were going to take the city by storm. Then I met Richard. He was charming, powerful, and utterly captivating. He swept me off my feet. He offered me a different kind of life, a life of ease and security. You won't have to work a day in your life, Ellie. He'd promised. I'll take care of everything. And he had. He had taken care of everything, including my dreams. I had packed them away, like old photographs, in a box in the attic of my mind. A soft knock on the study door pulled me from my thoughts. It was Sarah. She had come to the funeral court, a silent pillar of support in the back row. She closed the door behind her, her eyes full of the concern she couldn't show in her office. How are you holding up? She asked, her voice low. I managed a weak smile. I'm fine. It was the lie I had been telling for 30 years. She didn't believe it. Of course. She knew me better than that. She looked around the opulent room, at the symbols of Richard's power. Have they said anything yet? I shook my head. Not yet. But I can feel it. Sarah. Something's coming. The papers are secure. She assured me. The plan is in motion. He can't touch the most important parts. But your personal accounts. The house. Ellie. You have to be prepared. I took a deep breath, the scent of leather and old memories filling my lungs. I know. I am. But was I? I was prepared for a financial battle. A legal fight. I wasn't sure I was prepared for the look I had seen in my own son's eyes. Sarah gave my shoulder a squeeze. Call me the second you need anything. Then she was gone, slipping back into the crowd of mourners. I stayed in the study for another hour, listening as the sounds of the reception slowly faded. The voices grew fewer, the front door opening and closing until, finally, there was silence. A heavy, expectant silence that felt louder than all the noise before it. I walked out of the study. The house was empty, save for the three of us. The remnants of the gathering were everywhere: empty plates, crumpled napkins, a forgotten scarf on a chair. It looked like the aftermath of a party, but there had been no joy here. Leo and Jessica were standing in the grand foyer, near the sweeping staircase. Jessica was speaking to him in a low, urgent tone. When they saw me, they stopped. The air crackled with tension. Jessica gave me a small, tight smile. Eleanor, we were just saying, it's been such a long day. You must be exhausted. I looked at my son. His face was pale, his eyes shadowed with a combination of grief and something else. Something hard and unfamiliar. He wouldn't meet my gaze. He just stared at a point on the marble floor just past my shoulder. Leo? I said softly. He finally looked up. The warmth that had always been in his eyes, the light that was all his own, was gone. It was as if a switch had been flipped. His voice, when he spoke, was cold, formal, and utterly alien. Mom, he said, the words sounding foreign on his tongue. We need to talk. We need to talk. Leo repeated, and this time, there was no mistaking the steel in his voice. It was a poor imitation of his father's commanding tone, but the intent was the same. To dominate. To control. Jessica stepped forward, holding a thick manila envelope. She placed it on the polished mahogany table by the door. The sound it made was soft, but it echoed in the cavernous foyer like a gunshot. Dad's lawyer dropped this off this morning, Leo said, finally looking directly at me. His eyes were cold, emptied of any warmth we had ever shared. It's his will. The final one. Felt a slow, creeping dread. Richard's will. I knew exactly what was in Richard's will. We had drafted it together with our family attorney years ago. It was simple. Everything was to be split between me and Leo, with a trust to ensure my well-being for the rest of my life. I know what the will says, Leo, I said, keeping my voice steady. Jessica laughed. A short, sharp sound that was entirely without humor. Oh, I don't think you do. She gestured for Leo to open the envelope. He pulled out a set of documents, stapled together. It looked official, with signatures and a notary stamp at the end. But the paper was too crisp, the ink too fresh. Felt wrong. Dad changed it, Leo said flatly. A few months ago. He had concerns. Concerns? The word was a breath, a whisper of disbelief. Richard had never had concerns about me. I was his most reliable asset. He felt you weren't capable of managing the estate, Leo continued, his voice gaining a cruel momentum as he recited lines that were clearly not his own. He said you never understood the business, the pressure he was under, that all you did was spend the money he earned. Each word was a physical blow. 30 years of my life, of running his home, raising his son, hosting his business partners, tending to his every need, all of it reduced to a single, ugly verb: spend. I saw Jessica's influence clinging to every syllable. This was her poison, delivered by my son's hand. Leo, that's not true. Your father and I. My father is dead. He snapped, his voice cracking with a pain he couldn't fully conceal. He's dead. And he left me to clean up his mess, to run the company, to take care of everything. And I can't do that if I'm worried about you squandering the legacy he built. He pushed the document across the table toward me. He left everything to me. The company, the properties, the accounts. He paused, taking a sharp breath before delivering the final, fatal strike. The house. It's all in my name now. The silence that followed was absolute. I looked from the fake will to my son's face, searching for a flicker of doubt, a sign of the boy I had raised. But there was nothing. Only a stranger wearing his skin, his eyes reflecting a desperate, greedy hunger. He wanted to be the king now. And in his story, I was just an obstacle. I see, I said. My voice was eerily calm. The shock was so profound. It had frozen me, encasing my heart in a layer of ice. This was beyond grief. This was a betrayal so deep it felt like a part of my soul had been severed. So, Jessica said, stepping forward again, her tone falsely sweet. We thought it would be best for everyone if you found somewhere else to stay, to give Leo space to grieve and take charge. I didn't look at her. I kept my eyes on Leo. You're kicking me out? He flinched, but his jaw remained set. I'm following my father's wishes. This isn't what he would have wanted. Leo, you know that. What do you know about what he wanted? He shot back, his voice rising. You just sat here in this big, empty house while he worked himself to death. You have no idea what it takes. You're weak. He knew it. And so do I. Weak. The word hung in the air between us. It was Richard's word. The word he used whenever I had an opinion that differed from his. The word he used to dismiss my intelligence, my education, my dreams. Hearing it from my son's mouth broke something inside me. Not my spirit, but my heart. The part of it that had held out hope for the boy he used to be. I nodded slowly. All right. My simple agreement seemed to unnerve them. They had been prepared for a fight, for tears, for begging. They weren't prepared for quiet acceptance. Good, Jessica said, recovering quickly. Your things. We can have them packed and sent to you wherever you end up. I turned without another word and walked toward the door. My handbag was on the console table where I'd left it. I reached for it, my mind a blank slate, trying to process the first practical step. Where do I go? What do I do? Leo's hand shot out and clamped down on my wrist. I froze, startled by the rough contact. Leave it, he said. I looked down at his hand, then back up at his face. Leo, my wallet is in there. My phone. The credit cards are tied to the estate accounts, he said, his voice a low monotone. Which are now my accounts. The phone is on the family plan. My plan. You won't be needing them. He pried my fingers off the leather strap of my own handbag. He then held his hand out. The car keys, too. My hand went instinctively to my coat pocket. The keys to the Mercedes Richard had given me for my 50th birthday were there. For a moment, I hesitated. This was the final humiliation. The stripping away of every last piece of my life. I looked at my son, this cold, hard stranger, and I saw that there was no point in arguing. I was no longer his mother. I was a problem to be removed. Slowly, I pulled the keys out and dropped them into his outstretched palm. The jingle of the metal was the only sound in the vast, silent foyer. He pocketed them. Goodbye, Mom. He didn't say he loved me. He didn't say he was sorry. He just turned and walked up the grand staircase, leaving Jessica to finish the job. She opened the front door. The cold night air rushed in, a brutal shock to my system. I think it's time for you to go, Eleanor. I walked past her, out onto the stone porch of the home I had lived in for 30 years. The home where I had brought my baby boy home from the hospital. The home where I had bandaged his scraped knees and celebrated his birthdays. The door clicked shut behind me. I heard the deadbolt slide into place. Final, metallic thud. I stood there for a long moment, the wind whipping my hair around my face. The house loomed behind me, its windows warm and yellow, a beacon of a life that was no longer mine. I was 58 years old, standing on a dark street in a wealthy suburb with nothing but the clothes on my back. No phone. No money. No one. A wave of despair threatened to pull me under. My legs felt weak, my chest tight. I could collapse right here on the perfectly manicured lawn and let the cold take me. It would be easy. But then I thought of the look in Leo's eyes. The emptiness. The ghost of Richard's cruelty staring back at me. And I thought of the papers I had signed in Sarah's office. A different feeling began to rise through the despair. It wasn't hope. Not yet. It was something harder. Colder. It was resolve. I straightened my back. I clutched the fabric of my thin black coat. My fingers brushed against something small and hard in the pocket. It wasn't the car keys. I had given those to Leo. This was something else. Something I had put there that morning. Knowing this day might come, I pulled it out. In the dim glow of the street lamp, I could see it clearly. Single. Old-fashioned brass key. It was for a post office box I had opened under my maiden name 6 months ago. The key felt solid and real in my freezing hand. It was the first step. I did not look back at the house. I started walking. My steps were even and measured, clicking softly on the empty sidewalk. I walked away from the landscaped gardens and the 3-car garages. I walked past the homes of people who thought they knew me. It was a long walk. Miles to the edge of town where the neighborhoods were not so pristine. My feet began to ache, and the cold seeped deep into my bones. But I kept going. The 24-hour postal center was a small, functional building bathed in harsh fluorescent light. My hands were shaking as I found the box number 314. I slid the brass key into the lock. It turned with a satisfying click. Inside was a plain white envelope. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pulled it out. I tore it open. Contained $500 in cash. A prepaid burner phone still in its plastic packaging, and a folded piece of paper with a single phone number written on it. Sarah's private line. I walked out of the postal center and leaned against the cold brick wall outside. My hands fumbled with the cheap plastic of the phone, my fingers numb and clumsy. I powered it on. The screen lit up, bright and alien. I dialed the number. It rang twice before she picked up. Hello? Sarah's voice was tense. Sarah, I said, my own voice raspy from the cold and unshed tears. It's me. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. Ellie? Oh my God. Did it happen? I looked up at the starless, unforgiving sky. The first part of my old life was over. The first part of my new one was just beginning. Yes, I said, my voice growing stronger with every word. He did it. He threw me out. He took everything. I paused, taking a deep, steadying breath. It's time. It's time. The words hung in the cold night air. A declaration of war I never wanted to wage. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Then Sarah's voice returned. All business. The concern was still there, but it was now overlaid with the sharp focus of a seasoned lawyer. Where are you? She asked. At a postal center on the edge of town. Near the highway. Okay. Don't move. There's a motel about a block from there. The Northwood Inn. Cheap. But it's clean. Go there. Use the cash to get a room for a few nights. Pay day by day. Don't use your real name. Use Bennett. Eleanor Bennett. My maiden name. The name of the woman I used to be. The woman who was smart, capable, and had a future of her own. Hearing it felt like waking a part of myself that had been dormant for 3 decades. Okay. Sarah. The Northwood Inn. I'll be there in the morning. Ellie. We'll figure out the next steps. Just get inside. Get warm. And try to rest. You're safe now. But I wasn't safe. I was exposed, vulnerable, and utterly alone in a world that no longer recognized me. The conversation ended. And I was left with the dial tone humming in my ear. The cheap motel was exactly where she said it would be, its neon sign casting a sad, flickering pink glow onto the wet pavement. The man behind the plexiglass window looked at me with tired, uninterested eyes. He didn't question the woman in the expensive funeral coat paying in cash. In a place like this, people didn't ask questions. They just took the money. The room was small and smelled of stale cigarettes and pine-scented cleaner. The bedspread was a faded floral pattern, thin and scratchy to the touch. It was a universe away from my four-poster bed with its Egyptian cotton sheets. I sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress, the reality of my situation crashing down on me. I had nothing. Less than nothing. I was a ghost. A non-person. Eleanor Vance, the perfect wife of Maple Creek, had ceased to exist. I didn't sleep. I just stared at the water-stained ceiling, my mind racing. I saw Leo's face, twisted with a coldness I'd never seen before. I heard his voice calling me weak. Weak. The word echoed in the cheap, silent room. Was he right? Had I spent 30 years letting myself become weak? Letting Richard's power and money insulate me from the world until I forgot how to survive in it? No. That wasn't the whole truth. In the quiet moments, in the lonely afternoons when the house was empty, I hadn't just been reading novels. Richard thought my subscription to the Wall Street Journal was just a way to keep up with his world. He never knew I was also reading financial textbooks, taking online courses in forensic accounting, and keeping my mind sharp. Started as a hobby, a way to feel like the old me. But then, about a year ago, it became something more. It became a necessity. I had started noticing things, small inconsistencies in the company's books, which Richard still brought home out of habit. A ledger that didn't quite balance. A new shell corporation with a vague name registered in Delaware. When I asked him about it, he'd waved it away. Don't you worry your pretty little head about it, Ellie. It's just business. But I did worry. I started digging, using the skills I had secretly been honing for years. I pieced it together in the dead of night, in his study, while he slept upstairs, oblivious. The picture that emerged was terrifying. Richard, my powerful, respected husband, was not just aggressive in his business dealings. He was a criminal. He was involved in massive bid-rigging schemes, money laundering, and illegal payoffs to city officials. He had built his empire on a foundation of lies and corruption. And our perfect life, our beautiful home, Leo's future, it was all financed by fraud. The discovery had shattered me. I loved the man, or at least, the man I thought he was. But I couldn't ignore the truth. It was a ticking time bomb. If it ever went off, the explosion would destroy everything. And Leo, as his heir, would be standing at ground zero. He would inherit a poisoned chalice, facing criminal charges, lawsuit, and financial ruin. That was when I went to Sarah, not just as a friend, but as a lawyer. That was when the plan began to form. My secret plan. A way to dismantle Richard's criminal enterprise from the inside without him ever knowing. And to create a firewall that would protect our son from the fallout. The first step was creating a series of trusts and offshore accounts, legally separate from the Vance construction empire, and slowly, carefully, moving clean assets into them. It was a painstaking, dangerous process. I had to cover my tracks perfectly. It was my secret work. My real life's work. Richard's sudden heart attack had changed the timeline. It accelerated everything. I had thought I would have more time to untangle the web he had woven. Now, I had to detonate the bomb myself, before Leo became legally entangled in his father's crimes. Leo's betrayal, as painful as it was, had been an unexpected gift. By throwing me out, by taking everything with a forged will, he had unknowingly created a clear line of separation. He had made me a victim in the eyes of the law. He had given me the perfect cover. He thought he was seizing power. But he was just a puppet, and Jessica was pulling the strings. They had no idea they were sitting on a throne that was about to collapse into a sinkhole. They thought they had the keys to the kingdom. They didn't know that I had already changed all the locks. The next morning, Sarah arrived. She brought a bag with a change of clothes, simple jeans, sweater, comfortable shoes, and a container of hot coffee. Seeing her familiar, trustworthy face was like a lifeline. "You look terrible," she said, her tone blunt but kind. "I feel terrible," I admitted. We sat at the small, wobbly table in the motel room. She laid out a file. "Okay. Phase 1 is complete. You're officially estranged, with no access to funds. They've established a clear motive for you to be seen as a disgruntled wife, which is perfect." It was strange to hear my son's cruelty described as perfect, but I understood the cold logic. "Phase 2 begins now," she continued. "We need to start the leaks. Anonymously, of course. We'll begin with the bid rigging on the new City Hall project. It's the most well-documented of Richard's indiscretions." She pointed to a section of a flowchart she'd drawn. "I've identified a reporter at the Cleveland Plain Dealer, a guy named Ben Carter. He's young, hungry, and has a reputation for digging. We'll send him an anonymous tip, just enough to get him interested. A few key documents, a name of a disgruntled former employee you discovered." My mind flashed back to a conversation I'd overheard between Richard and his chief financial officer. They were laughing about a site manager they had fired, a man named Frank Miller, who had asked too many questions about the quality of the concrete being used. I had found Frank Miller's contact information. I had everything we needed. "I have the documents," I said, my voice steady. "And the name." For the next few weeks, the dingy motel room became my command center. It was a strange, clandestine existence. During the day, I ventured out to the public library, using their computers to access the encrypted files I had stored on a cloud server. I spent hours poring over spreadsheets, blueprints, and bank statements, tracing the flow of dirty money through a dizzying maze of shell companies. At night, I would return to the motel, using the burner phone to coordinate with Sarah. We sent the first package to Ben Carter. It was just a taste. A copy of an internal email and a doctored invoice. Enough to raise an eyebrow. We waited. Meanwhile, I imagined life back at the house. I pictured Leo sitting behind his father's massive desk, playing the part of the CEO. I could see Jessica redecorating, erasing every trace of me from the home I had created. I imagined they were celebrating, drinking expensive champagne, believing they had one. A week later, a small article appeared on page B4 of the Plain Dealer. The headline was innocuous: "Questions raised over City Hall construction bids." It was Ben Carter's byline. He mentioned anonymous sources and irregularities in the bidding process. It was a small spark, but for us, it was a bonfire. Leo wouldn't have seen it. He never read the paper, but someone at the company would have. The first tremor would be running through the foundations of Vance Construction. Our next leak was more significant. We sent Carter proof of a payoff to a city councilman. This time, the story made the front page of the local section. The councilman issued a furious denial. The mayor's office promised a full internal review. I felt a pang of guilt. These were people's lives we were affecting. But then I remembered the purpose. This wasn't about revenge. It was about surgery. Painful, messy operation to cut a cancer out of my son's life before it consumed him completely. Sarah and I met at a small diner halfway between the city and my motel hideout. She slid a new burner phone across the table. We had to change them every 2 weeks. "It's working, Ellie," she said, stirring her coffee. "The sharks are starting to circle. I've heard whispers from my contacts at the U.S. Attorney's office. They're sniffing around. It won't be long before they open a formal investigation." "And Leo?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "How is he?" Sarah's expression softened. From what I can gather. Not great. He's in over his head. Richard made it all look so easy. But Leo doesn't have his father's experience or his ruthlessness. He's making mistakes. Big ones. He tried to fast-track a new condo development without the proper permits, and it's become a mess. He's spending money like water, trying to project an image of success. Jessica is helping, I'm sure. I closed my eyes. My foolish boy. He was trying to wear his father's shoes, not realizing they were filled with lead. He was trying to fly, not knowing his wings were made of wax, and he was flying too close to a sun that I had ignited. We need to increase the pressure, I said, opening my eyes. The resolve was back. It's time to go after the money. This was the most dangerous part of the plan. Using my knowledge of Richard's offshore network, we began to create problems. A missed wire transfer here. A compliance flag on an account in the Cayman Islands there. Small, bureaucratic hurdles that would start to choke off the flow of cash that kept the company afloat. It was intricate, delicate work. One mistake, one digital footprint left behind, and it could all be traced back to me. I was living on adrenaline and cheap coffee. I had lost weight. There were dark circles under my eyes. But I had never felt more alive. The woman who arranged flower bouquets and planned dinner parties was gone. In her place was Eleanor Bennett, the forensic accountant. And she was good at her job. One evening, I made a mistake. A moment of weakness. I took a bus into Maple Creek. I got off a few blocks from my old house and walked, staying in the shadows of the manicured oak trees. I just wanted to see it. The house was blazing with light. There was a party going on. I could hear loud music and laughter spilling out onto the lawn. Through the large bay window in the living room, I could see them. Leo was holding a champagne bottle, spraying it over a crowd of young, laughing people. Jessica was beside him, her arm around his waist, her face flushed with triumph. They looked like the king and queen of a glittering, careless world. My son, celebrating his inheritance on the ruins of his father's crimes, completely oblivious to the storm that was about to break over his head. Tears pricked my eyes. It was a bitter, painful sight. He looked happy. He looked free. And it was all a lie. I turned away. The sound of their laughter chasing me down the dark, quiet street. He hated me for being weak. But he had no idea what strength really was. It wasn't about shouting and commanding. It was about the quiet, patient, and methodical work of a woman who was willing to lose everything to save him from himself. The laughter from the party echoed in my head long after I'd returned to the sterile silence of my motel room. It was the sound of blissful ignorance, and it sharpened my resolve. My son was dancing on a volcano, and it was my job to create the eruption that would force him to safer ground, even if he got burned in the process. The next phase of the plan was the riskiest yet. It involved not just leaking information, but actively manipulating the financial structures Richard had built. He had a favorite shell corporation, a company called Apex Global Holdings, registered in Panama. It was the central hub, the heart of his money laundering operation. All the illicit funds flowed through it before being distributed to other, smaller accounts. Shutting it down was like cutting off the blood supply to the entire criminal enterprise. Through my late-night research, I had discovered that Richard, in his arrogance, had used a single, overworked lawyer in Panama City to manage dozens of these front companies. He paid the man well to be discreet and incurious. I also discovered that this lawyer had a weakness: online poker. And he was careless with his digital security. Took me a week, working from the library's public computers and routing my connection through a dozen proxy servers. But I did it. I gained access to his system. It wasn't a sophisticated hack. It was more like walking through a door he'd left unlocked. Inside, I found the digital keys to the kingdom. I found the documents, the transfer codes, the proof of ownership for Apex Global Holdings. I didn't steal anything. That wasn't the point. I simply complicated things. I filed a change of address form for the corporation, redirecting its mail to a vacant lot in Miami. I submitted a query with the Panamanian financial authorities, flagging the account for a routine anti-money laundering review, citing an anonymous tip about suspicious activity. It was a small, bureaucratic tripwire, but in the world of international finance, a compliance review could freeze an account for months. While I was laying these digital traps, Leo was walking into them. He was trying to run a multi-million-dollar company, and suddenly, the money wasn't moving the way it was supposed to. A payment to a key supplier would bounce. A wire transfer for payroll would be delayed for administrative review. From Sarah's sources, I heard the whispers of panic starting to emanate from the Vance Construction headquarters. Leo, I was told, was becoming erratic. He was shouting at his accounting department, accusing them of incompetence. He couldn't understand why simple transactions were suddenly becoming impossibly complex. He was like a driver who didn't know someone had poured sugar in his gas tank. He just kept turning the key, getting more and more frustrated when the engine sputtered and died. Jessica, predictably, was not helping. Her solution to the growing financial pressure was to spend more, to maintain the illusion of wealth and success. She leased a new Porsche for Leo and bought herself a diamond necklace that cost more than my entire year's living expenses had been. They were hemorrhaging money, trying to plug 100 leaks with fistfuls of cash, not realizing the dam was about to break. The midpoint of my plan arrived in the form of a formal letter. Sarah showed it to me during one of our clandestine meetings. It was from the Internal Revenue Service, Criminal Investigation Division. It was a notification of a full-scale audit and investigation into the financial affairs of Vance Construction and the late Richard Vance. This is it, Ellie, Sarah said, her voice a low, serious hum. Once the IRS gets involved, it's a different game. They have resources we can only dream of. They will find everything. I stared at the official letterhead, my heart pounding a strange rhythm of fear and triumph. What does this mean for Leo? It means the clock is ticking. Right now. He's the acting CEO, the man in charge. When they find the fraud, and they will assume he is part of it, the pressure on him is about to become immense. The pressure mounted faster than I had anticipated. IRS agents descended on the company's offices, carting away boxes of files. Key employees were subpoenaed for interviews. The company's bank accounts were frozen, pending the investigation. Suddenly, the steady stream of money that had fueled Leo's lavish lifestyle dried up to a trickle, and then to nothing at all. I thought of Leo in that moment, not with anger, but with a deep, aching pity. He had been so desperate to prove he was his father's son, to show the world and himself that he was strong and capable. Now, the empire he had so proudly claimed was turning to dust in his hands. He was trapped. To make matters worse, Ben Carter's reporting had gone from local news to a syndicated story. Corruption scandal engulfs prominent Ohio developer, the headlines screamed. Richard's name was being dragged through the mud, and by extension, so was Leo's. Business partners who had clapped him on the back at the funeral were now refusing to take his calls. The vultures were circling. I stayed hidden, a ghost pulling strings from the shadows. My life had shrunk to the four walls of the motel room and the anonymous glow of a library computer screen. I learned to live on cheap food from the vending machine down the hall. I learned to sleep in short, fitful bursts, always half listening for a knock on the door that would never come. I filled the long, lonely hours by remembering. I let my mind drift back to Leo as a child, before his father's shadow had grown so long. I remembered teaching him how to ride a bike in the park, his small hands gripping the handlebars with fierce determination. I remembered him building elaborate cities out of Legos on the living room floor, his imagination boundless. He had been such a bright, gentle boy. Where had he gone? I realized that Richard's control had damaged us both. It had forced me into a role of quiet subservience, and it had forced Leo into a role of constant, desperate striving. He wasn't just trying to win his father's approval. He was trying to survive it. His anger at me wasn't just about weakness. It was a lifetime of resentment for my passivity, for not standing up to the man who suffocated us both. He saw my silence as complicity. And perhaps, in a way, it was. This wasn't just about saving Leo from prison. It was about showing him a different kind of strength. It was about proving that the quiet, gentle woman he had dismissed was more resourceful and more resilient than the loud, powerful man he had idolized. The breaking point came, as I knew it would, from Jessica. She was a creature of comfort and security. Her loyalty was to the Vance fortune, not to the Vance men. When the fortune disappeared, so would she. Sarah got the news from a friend who worked at one of the upscale boutiques in town. Jessica had come in and tried to make a large purchase, but all her credit cards were declined. The saleswoman described her as being furious, then panicked. Later that day, a teller at Leo's bank, a friend of Sarah's, reported that Jessica had come in and closed a joint savings account she held with Leo, withdrawing the last $30,000 that was in it. She had packed her bags and disappeared. She didn't even leave him a note. She just vanished, like a fair weather bird fleeing before the first winter storm. She had been the catalyst for his betrayal of me, the voice whispering poison in his ear. And when the illusion of wealth shattered, she was the first to abandon the wreckage. I knew this would devastate him. More than the money, more than the company. Her abandonment would be the ultimate confirmation of his failure. He had thrown away his family for her, and she had thrown him away for a depleted bank account. That night, a storm rolled into Ohio. Rain lashed against the motel window, and the wind howled. I watched the lightning flash across the sky, feeling a strange kinship with the tempest outside. The world I had known had been torn apart, and now, so had his. We were both adrift in the storm. I knew he would be alone in that vast, empty house. The lights would be off because the bills hadn't been paid. The caterers and the party guests were long gone. He would be sitting in the dark, in his father's chair, surrounded by the symbols of a power that was never really his. He would be utterly, completely broken. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of fear. Had I pushed him too far? Had my calculated plan to save him ended up destroying him instead? The goal was to bring him to his knees so he could learn to stand up on his own. But what if he never got up again? The burner phone on the nightstand rang. The sound was so jarring in the quiet room that I jumped. I had only ever given the number to Sarah. It couldn't be her. It was 2 a.m. My hand trembled as I picked it up. I flipped it open and pressed it to my ear, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Hello?" I whispered. There was silence on the other end, just the sound of ragged, uneven breathing. And then, a voice. It was hoarse, broken, and so full of despair it was almost unrecognizable. "Mom?" It was Leo. "Leo?" My voice was a choked whisper. Hearing his voice after all this time, so raw and broken, sent a jolt through my system. All the anger, all the calculated distance I had built around my heart, crumbled in an instant. He was still my son. "Mom, I didn't know who else to call," he stammered, his words punctuated by shaky breaths. In the background, I could hear the rain drumming, a mournful percussion to his pain. "Everything's gone. The money, the company, Jessica. She's gone." I stayed silent, letting him talk. This wasn't the time for "I told you so." It was the time to listen. "The IRS is. They're saying Dad. They're saying he was a crook." The realization was still new to him, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "They think I was a part of it. They think I knew. But I didn't. Mom, I swear I didn't know." His voice cracked on the last word. And I heard a sound that I hadn't heard from him since he was a small boy who had fallen off his bike, a dry, racking sob. My own throat tightened. Where are you? Leo? I'm at the house. Or, what used to be the house. There are foreclosure notices on the door. The power is going to be shut off tomorrow. He let out a bitter, humorless laugh. The king in his castle. Some king. I took a deep breath. My mind racing. The plan had reached its critical phase. He was broken. As I had intended. He was stripped of the arrogance and the false power his father's name had given him. He was ready to see the truth. I need to see you. He pleaded. Please. I need to understand what's happening. You were always the smart one. You always saw things Dad and I didn't. Did you know? Did you know what he was doing? This was the moment of truth. My heart ached to run to him. To wrap my arms around him and tell him everything would be okay. But it wouldn't be. Not yet. The surgery wasn't over. I had to make the final, deepest cut. Meet me tomorrow morning. I said. My voice firmer than I felt. 10 o'clock. There's a place called the Oak Leaf Diner. On the old highway out of town. Come alone. Okay. Mom. Okay. I'll be there. He sounded so desperate. So willing to cling to any instruction I gave him. The power dynamic between us had irrevocably shifted. I hung up the phone. My hand shaking. I immediately called Sarah. I woke her up. But she was instantly alert when she heard the urgency in my voice. He called. I said. It's time for the final piece. The reveal. Are you ready for this? Ellie? Sarah asked gently. He's going to be angry. He's going to feel manipulated. Betrayed all over again. I know. I said. Looking at my reflection in the dark motel window. A stranger looked back at me, a tired, worn woman who had orchestrated the collapse of her own family to save it. But it's the only way he'll ever understand. He needs to know that this wasn't a punishment. It was a rescue. The Oak Leaf Diner was a relic from another era, with red vinyl booths and a jukebox in the corner that hadn't worked in years. It was the kind of anonymous, out-of-the-way place where no one from Maple Creek would ever be seen. I chose a booth in the back, facing the door. I ordered a black coffee and waited. He arrived exactly at 10. He looked like a ghost. His expensive suit was wrinkled. His hair was unkempt. And his face was pale and gaunt. The arrogant young man who had thrown me out of my home was gone. In his place was a lost, frightened boy. He slid into the booth opposite me. His movements slow and heavy. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He just stared into his own reflection in the Formica tabletop. Thank you for coming, he mumbled. I took a sip of my coffee, buying myself a moment to compose my thoughts. Leo, I began, my voice quiet but clear. You asked me if I knew what your father was doing. The answer is yes. I knew. His head snapped up. His eyes, red-rimmed and filled with a confusing mix of hope and hurt, locked onto mine. You knew? For how long? I found out about a year ago. I started looking into the company's finances. There were things that didn't add up. Took me months, but I pieced it all together. The fraud, the money laundering, everything. He looked stunned, betrayed. A year? You knew for a year and you didn't say anything? You let him. You let me. What could I have said? Leo? I asked, leaning forward. If I had confronted your father, he would have denied it. He would have hidden it better, moved the money, and shut me out completely. And if I had told you, would you have believed me? Or would you have believed him? He had no answer. We both knew he would have sided with his father. He had always sided with his father. I loved your father, I said softly. And it was the truth. But I couldn't let his crimes destroy you. When he died, the entire legal and financial responsibility for that criminal enterprise was about to fall on your shoulders. You would have gone to prison. Leo, For a very long time. He shook his head, struggling to process it. So what happened? How did it all fall apart so fast? The investigation. The accounts being frozen. It was like someone was pulling a thread and the whole thing just unraveled overnight. I reached into my bag and pulled out a single, folded piece of paper. It was a copy of the anonymous tip sheet we had sent to the IRS, detailing the exact location of the most incriminating files. I pushed it across the table toward him. He picked it up. His brow furrowed in confusion. He read it, his eyes widening with each line. Then he looked back at me, a dawning horror on his face. Who sent this? He whispered. I met his gaze and held it. I didn't flinch. I did. The color drained from his face. He looked as if I had just struck him. You? He breathed. You did this? You destroyed the company? You destroyed Dad's legacy? You destroyed me? No, Leo, I said, my voice firm. Your father destroyed his own legacy when he chose to become a criminal. I didn't destroy the company. I exposed a crime. And I didn't destroy you. I saved you. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the linoleum floor. The few other patrons in the diner turned to look. Saved me? You call this saving me? I have nothing. I've lost everything. Because of you. His voice was rising, cracking with rage and grief. You've lost a house built on lies. I countered, my voice staying level, cutting through his anger. You've lost money that was stolen from other people. You lost a woman who only wanted you for that money. What? Exactly. Of value have you truly lost? He stared at me, his chest heaving. He was a cornered animal, lashing out in pain and confusion. You threw it all away. For what? Some kind of moral high ground? You left me with nothing. I left you with a chance, I said, my own voice finally rising with the force of a year's worth of fear and determination. A chance to build your own life. An honest life. Not one lived in the shadow of your father's crimes. I knew the IRS was coming. Leo. I knew the whole thing was going to collapse. So I made a deal. That stopped him. A deal? What deal? I have been working as a confidential informant for the U.S. Attorney's office for the past 6 months, I said, laying my trump card on the table. I provided them with everything they needed to prosecute the real criminals in your father's organization. In exchange for my full cooperation, they have agreed to grant you full immunity. He sank back into his seat, the anger draining out of him, replaced by sheer, uncomprehending shock. Immunity? You will not be charged. Leo, you will lose the money. Yes, the house, the company, it will all be seized as assets of a criminal enterprise. But you will be free. You will have a clean slate. He just stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. He was finally seeing the full picture. The months of strange financial problems, the perfectly timed leaks to the press, the swiftness of the federal investigation. It wasn't a random collapse. It was a controlled demolition. And I was the one with my hand on the plunger. When you threw me out, he began, his voice barely audible. When you took everything, that was part of it, wasn't it? I nodded. It was the best thing you could have done for me. It proved to the investigators that I was not a beneficiary of the fraud. It made me a credible, estranged witness, not an accomplice. Your cruelty, Leo, was my alibi. It was the final piece I needed to protect us both. The full weight of it finally hit him. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. The sounds he made were not of anger anymore, but of a profound, soul-deep sorrow. He was mourning everything at once. The father he idolized, the wealth he'd taken for granted, the mother he had betrayed, and the man he thought he was. He was seeing the truth for the first time, and it was devastating. I let him cry. I reached across the table and, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I placed my hand on his. His skin was cold. He didn't pull away. We sat there in silence in the back of a cheap diner. Two survivors in the wreckage of a life. The quiet hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the world. The storm was finally over. Now, we had to see what was left standing in the ruins. The silence in the diner booth stretched on, thick with unspoken emotions. Leo's sobs subsided into ragged, weary breaths. He slowly lifted his head from his hands, his face streaked with tears, his eyes filled with a dawning, terrible clarity. The anger was gone, replaced by a shame so profound it seemed to weigh him down. All this time, he whispered, his voice hoarse. You were out there. With nothing. Living in. Where were you living? A motel. I said simply. It wasn't so bad. He shook his head. A fresh wave of self-loathing washing over him. I threw you out. I took your keys. I left you on the street without $1. And you were saving my life. The words were a confession. An admission of a sin he was only just beginning to comprehend. I was saving my son. I corrected him gently. It's what mothers do. He looked at me then. Truly looked at me. Perhaps for the first time since he was a child. He wasn't looking at the quiet, passive woman who arranged his father's dinner parties. He was seeing the strategist, the survivor, the woman who had outmaneuvered his brilliant, criminal father and the entire federal government to protect him. He was seeing a strength he had never known existed. Why didn't you hate me? He asked, his voice cracking. I deserved it. Everything I said to you. Everything I did. I was horrible. I was so blind. I wasn't happy with you, Leo. I admit it. Alright? Sad smile touching my lips. But hate you? You are my son. Hating you would be like hating a part of myself. I was angry at the hold your father had on you. Even after he was gone. I was angry at the greed Jessica inspired in you. But the boy I raised, the one who built Lego cities and was afraid of thunderstorms, I could never hate him. I was just trying to find him again. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, like a little boy. He's been lost for a long time. Maybe he's not lost. I suggested. Maybe he just needs a new map. The waitress came by and refilled our coffee cups, her expression carefully neutral, though she had clearly sensed the emotional storm that had passed through our booth. The simple, normal act seemed to ground us, pulling us back to the present moment. So what happens now? Leo asked, his voice small. To me? Now, I said, taking a sip of the hot coffee. You face the consequences. Not the legal ones. Those are taken care of. But the personal ones. You have to accept that the life you knew is over. The money is gone. The Vance name is now associated with a scandal. You have to start over. From nothing. The word nothing hung in the air. For him, a week ago, nothing would have been a terrifying void. Now, I could see in his eyes that it sounded different. It sounded like a chance. And the company? He asked. It will be dismantled. The assets will be seized by the government to pay back fines and compensate the people your father cheated. The employees, many of them will lose their jobs. That is part of the fallout. Leo, part of the damage your father caused. He visibly flinched at that. The thought of the innocent people, the foremen and secretaries and laborers who had worked for his father for years, now being out of a job because of his crime sit was another layer of the harsh reality he had to face. This wasn't a victimless crime. I have to do something, he said. A flicker of his old self. The need to take action. Returning. I have to talk to them. Explain. No. I said firmly. You can't. You are part of the investigation. You can't interfere. The best thing you can do for them, and for yourself, is to be quiet. Stay out of the way. and let the legal process unfold. Your story is that you were a son who was kept in the dark, who was duped by his own father. Which is the truth?" He slumped back in the booth, the weight of his own powerlessness settling upon him. He, who had wanted to be the king, was now just a pawn being moved off the board. "And you?" he asked, his gaze filled with a new, raw concern. "What about you? You have nothing either." I smiled. A real smile this time. Felt strange on my face, like a muscle I hadn't used in a long time. "Oh, I wouldn't say that." I reached into my bag again and pulled out another folder. This one was much thinner. I slid it across the table. It was a bank statement. He opened it cautiously. His eyes scanned the page, then widened in disbelief. The account was under the name Bennett Trust. The balance was just over $2 million. "What is this?" he breathed. "That," I said, "is my severance package." He stared at me, utterly bewildered. "Your father was a criminal, Leo. But he wasn't always a fool. Long before the serious fraud began, back when the company was still mostly legitimate, he made some very smart, very clean investments. He put them in my name. For tax purposes. A portfolio of stocks. Some real estate. He called it my rainy day fund, and then promptly forgot all about it. He was too busy with his bigger, more exciting schemes. I had not forgotten. Over the years, I had managed that portfolio myself. I sold the properties when the market was high. I reinvested the stock dividends. I had grown it, carefully and legally, completely separate from the toxic assets of Vance Construction. It was the one part of our wealth that was truly clean. And it was all in my maiden name, protected within a series of trusts that Sarah had helped me structure. Untouchable by the IRS, by his creditors, and by him. This money was the seed for our plan. I explained. It funded the lawyers, the investigators Sarah hired, my living expenses. This is what's left. It's not the Vance fortune, not by a long shot, but it's ours. And it's clean. He looked from the bank statement back to my face, and his expression was one of pure awe. He wasn't just looking at his mother anymore. He was looking at a mastermind, a woman who had played a long, dangerous game and had, against all odds, won. So the plan wasn't just about the immunity, he said slowly, connecting the last dots. It was about this, about saving something real for us. It was about saving you, Leo. The money is just a tool. It gives us a new beginning. He closed the folder and pushed it back to me. I don't want it, he said quietly. After what I did, I don't deserve any of it. It's not for you to deserve, I told him. It's for me to give. This isn't a reward, Leo. It's a resource. We're a family. What's left of it? And we're going to need it to rebuild. The word "we" hung between us. It was a question. Could there still be a we? After the lies, the betrayal, the destruction? He looked out the diner window at the gray, overcast sky. I don't know how to start over, he confessed, his voice filled with a vulnerability he would never have shown before. I don't know how to do anything. All I ever knew was how to be Richard Vance's son. I know, I said softly. So maybe you start there, by learning how to be Leo. We left the diner and stepped out into the cold November air. The world felt different. The future, which had been a terrifying blank space for both of us, now seemed to hold a sliver of possibility. I have to go back to the house, he said. Pack a few things before they change the locks. I nodded. Take what's important, not what's expensive. Photographs. Your grandfather's watch. Things that matter. He hesitated for a moment, then turned to me, his eyes pleading. Will you come with me? It was the last thing I expected him to ask. To go back to that house. The scene of my greatest humiliation. With the son who had orchestrated it. A part of me wanted to say no. That life was over. That house was a tomb of bad memories. But I looked at his face. At the fear and shame and desperate need for connection in his eyes. And I knew I had to say yes. This was the first step in rebuilding. We had to walk back into the ruins together before we could start to build something new. Yes, Leo, I said. I'll come with you. As we walked toward his beat-up old car, the fancy Porsche having been repossessed weeks ago, a thought occurred to me. It was a memory, a flashback to that first awful night. Standing on the porch, the door locked behind me, feeling utterly alone, and the key in my pocket, the key that started it all. My son thought he had taken everything from me. He thought he had left me with nothing. But he was wrong. He had left me with the one thing I needed most. He had left me with my freedom. The freedom to become the woman I was always meant to be. And in doing so, he had given me the power to give him his freedom in return. The circle was now complete. The drive back to Maple Creek was surreal. I sat in the passenger seat of Leo's old, sputtering sedan, a car he'd kept from his college days, and watched the familiar, opulent houses of my old neighborhood slide past the window. They looked different now. Like elaborate movie sets for a film I was no longer a part of. The perfectly manicured lawns, the towering oak trees, the stately brick facades, they seemed fragile. A beautiful but hollow shell hiding secrets I now knew all too well. Leo drove in silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. He was a stranger in his own life, retracing his steps back to the scene of his greatest failure. I could only imagine the war of emotions raging inside him. Shame, regret, fear, and perhaps, underneath it all, a sliver of relief. The burden of being Richard Vance's heir had been lifted, but it had been replaced by the terrifying emptiness of an unknown future. When we pulled into the long, sweeping driveway of the house, it felt like arriving at a funeral. The place already had an air of abandonment. The lawn, usually immaculate, was strewn with a few wind-blown leaves. A bright orange foreclosure notice was plastered to the grand front door, a garish symbol of our family's spectacular fall from grace. Leo fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking slightly. The lock, which had clicked shut with such finality the night he threw me out, now opened with a soft, pathetic sigh. We stepped inside. The grand foyer, once a symbol of our wealth and success, was a disaster. The remnants of Leo's last party were everywhere. Empty bottles and glasses littered the mahogany table. An ashtray had overflowed onto the marble floor. The air was stale, smelling of old champagne and regret. This wasn't just a messy house. It was the physical manifestation of a life that had spun out of control. Leo looked around at the wreckage, his face a mask of shame. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words directed at me, at the house, at the memory of the life we'd once had. I let it all fall apart. It was already broken. "Leo," I said gently, stepping past him. "You just made the cracks visible." We walked through the silent, cavernous rooms together. It was a strange, painful pilgrimage. In the living room, I saw the ghost of a younger Leo, showing me a picture he'd drawn in kindergarten. In the dining room, I saw Richard at the head of the table, booming with laughter at some story. The king and his court. Every corner held a memory, and every memory was now tainted by the truth of what lay beneath the surface. Leo went upstairs to his room to pack a bag. I found myself drawn, as if by some magnetic force, back to Richard's study. The room was exactly as I remembered it, a shrine to a man who was both more and less than he appeared. His heavy leather chair sat empty behind the desk. Silent, powerful throne. I ran my hand over the cool, polished wood of the desk. This room had been the epicenter of my fear and my liberation. It was here that I had felt most invisible. And it was here that I had found the evidence that would set me free. Leo came and stood in the doorway, holding a single duffel bag. It looked impossibly small, a paltry collection of belongings to represent a life of immense privilege. "I don't know what to take," he said, his voice hollow. "None of it feels like mine anymore." "Take the photograph on the mantelpiece," I told him, pointing to a silver frame. It was a picture of the three of us, taken on a vacation in Maine years ago. We were all smiling. Leo was a gangly teenager with a goofy grin. Richard looked genuinely relaxed for once, and I was looking at my son with an expression of pure, uncomplicated love. It was from a time before the lies had grown too big to ignore. "That's real. That was ours." He took the frame, his fingers tracing the outline of our faces. He packed it carefully into his bag, cushioning it with a sweater. We spent the next hour gathering a few more things. His father's old watch, which had belonged to his grandfather. My grandmother's jewelry box, which Richard had always insisted I keep in the main safe. Few books. We moved with a quiet, somber efficiency, two scavengers picking through the ruins of our own lives. As we were about to leave, I stopped in the foyer. I looked up the grand, sweeping staircase where Leo had stood with Jessica, his face cold and hard as he dismissed me from his life. It felt like a scene from 100 years ago. "Leo," I said, turning to him, "there's one more thing you need to understand." He looked at me, his eyes full of a weary readiness. He was prepared for another revelation, another painful truth. "Your father," I began, choosing my words carefully. "He was a difficult man. He was controlling, and his pride often made him cruel. But he loved you. In his own flawed, complicated way. He loved you more than anything." Leo looked skeptical. He put a mountain of debt and a prison sentence on my shoulders. That's a strange way of showing love. He didn't think he would ever get caught, I explained. In his mind, he was a giant, too big to fail. He wasn't building a criminal enterprise. He was building a dynasty for you. Everything he did, every law he broke, every person he cheated in his mind, it was all to give you a life better than his, to make sure you never had to struggle the way he did as a young man. It was a twisted, broken kind of love, but it was the only kind he knew how to give. I walked over to the wall behind the staircase, a section of ornate wood paneling. He showed me this once, a long time ago. He made me promise never to tell you about it until he was gone. I pressed on a specific knot in the wood. There was a soft click, and a section of the paneling swung inward, revealing a small, hidden safe. Leo stared, his mouth agape. "I've lived in this house my whole life. I never knew that was there." "He installed it himself," I said. "It wasn't connected to the main security system. It was his private escape hatch." The safe required a combination. I spun the dial, the numbers coming to me from a distant memory. The day Leo was born, August 14th, 814. The heavy steel door swung open. Inside, there wasn't cash or gold bars. There was just a thick leather-bound ledger and a single, sealed envelope with Leo written on the front in Richard's bold, familiar handwriting. I handed the envelope to my son. His hands trembled as he took it. He broke the seal and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He read it, his expression shifting from confusion to shock, and finally, to a deep, gut-wrenching grief. Tears welled in his eyes and streamed down his face as he read his father's last words. He held the letter out for me to see. It wasn't an apology or a confession. It was a guide. It detailed every shell corporation, every offshore account, every corrupt official he had on his payroll. It was a complete and total confession of his entire criminal career. And at the bottom, he had written a short, final note to his son. "Leo," it read, "if you are reading this, it means the worst has happened. This is the real map of the kingdom. I built it for you. But I built it on bad ground. If it all comes crashing down, use this. Give it to the authorities. Tell them you just found it. Tell them you knew nothing. Let them blame me for everything. It's the truth anyway. Protect your mother. Your name is the only thing that really matters. Don't let them take that from you. Dad. Leo sank to the floor, clutching the letter to his chest, his body racked with sobs. This was the final, most complicated piece of the puzzle. His father, the man who had burdened him with a poisoned legacy, had also, in his own way, tried to provide him with an escape. He had been a monster, but he had been a monster who loved his son. He knew. Leo cried, looking up at me, his face a mess of tears and dawning understanding. He knew it could all fall apart, and he tried to protect me. Yes, I said, my own eyes blurring with tears. He did. But his plan was flawed. He was still trying to control everything, even from beyond the grave. Handing this over would have made you look guilty, like you were hiding it. My way was better. Kept you completely clean. I picked up the heavy ledger from the safe. This is what the IRS has been looking for. This is the master key. It corroborates everything I told them and proves, beyond any doubt, where the guilt lies. We walked out of that house for the last time, closing the door on the ghosts of Richard Vance and the life he had built. We left the foreclosure notice on the door. It no longer had any power over us. As we drove away, Leo looked back at the grand, empty mansion one last time. Goodbye, he whispered. It wasn't just goodbye to a house. It was goodbye to his father, to his childhood, to the person he used to be. It was the sound of a final, painful, and necessary letting go. The past was finally being laid to rest. Now, all that was left was the vast, uncertain, and utterly clean slate of the future. 3 months later, the Ohio winter had settled in, blanketing the world in a clean, quiet layer of snow. The scandal of Vance Construction was old news, a story that had been told and dissected on the local news before being replaced by the next outrage, the next tragedy. The wheels of justice had turned. Several of Richard's key associates and a handful of city officials were facing indictments. The company's assets were liquidated. The house sold at auction to a stranger who would paint over our memories with their own. The Vance name, once a symbol of power in Maple Creek, was now a quiet cautionary tale. We didn't live in Maple Creek anymore. We didn't live anywhere that resembled it. Our new home was a small, 2-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a walk-up building in a modest, working-class neighborhood on the west side of Cleveland. The view from our window wasn't of manicured lawns and oak trees, but of brick walls and the elevated train tracks a block away. The rumble of the train passing was a constant, rhythmic reminder that we were in a different world now. A world that moved and worked and strived in a way our old one never had. The $2 million from my trust fund was more than enough to live on. But we lived simply. We had furnished the apartment with second-hand furniture, each piece chosen for its utility, not its brand name. There was a strange freedom in it. For the first time in my adult life, I owned things that weren't meant to impress anyone, things that were just ours. The ledger from Richard's secret safe, delivered anonymously by Sarah to the U.S. Attorney's office, had been the final nail in the coffin of his criminal enterprise. It had accelerated the investigation and solidified my deal. Leo was officially and completely in the clear. A footnote in a story that was no longer about him. Our life together in the small apartment was quiet and awkward at first. We were like two strangers forced to be roommates, learning each other's rhythms and routines. We were rebuilding a relationship from the ground up, on a new foundation of honesty. The old roles were gone. I was no longer the passive housewife, and he was no longer the entitled heir. We had to figure out who we were to each other now. Leo took the fall harder than I could have imagined. not the loss of the money or the status. He was crushed by the weight of his father's sins and his own behavior. For weeks, he barely left the apartment. He slept a lot and said little, processing the seismic shift in his reality. I gave him his space. I didn't push or prod. I just made sure there was always hot coffee in the morning and a warm meal in the evening. I was his mother. But I was also just a steady presence. A quiet anchor in the storm of his grief and shame. One morning, I found him sitting at our small kitchen table, staring at the classified section of the newspaper. "What are you looking at?" I asked gently. He looked up. A flicker of something I hadn't seen in a long time in his eyes. Purpose. "Jobs," he said. "I need to get a job. I can't just live off your money. Mom, I need to do something. Something real." His business degree from a prestigious university was now attached to a toxic name. No corporation would hire him for a management position. He knew that. So he started at the bottom. His first job was working in the stockroom of a large home improvement store. It was physically demanding, anonymous, low-paying work. He would come home in the evenings, his body aching, his hands covered in scrapes and calluses. He was exhausted. But he was different. The perpetual anxiety that had always simmered beneath his surface was gone, replaced by a simple, grounding weariness. He was learning the value of a dollar earned through his own sweat. He was discovering the quiet dignity of a hard day's work. Sometimes, he would talk about his day. He'd tell me about the grumpy forklift driver, or the challenge of organizing a new shipment of lumber. These were small, mundane stories, but they were his. They weren't filtered through the lens of his father's expectations. He was building something of his own, even if it was just a well-organized shelf of paint cans. As for me, I found my own new beginning. I enrolled at the local community college, signing up for a single class at first, a refresher course in advanced accounting. Sitting in a classroom for the first time in nearly 40 years was terrifying and exhilarating. I was old enough to be the mother of most of my classmates, and even the professor. But in that room, I wasn't Richard Vance's widow or Leo's mother. I was just Eleanor Bennett, a woman with a sharp mind for numbers. My brain, which had lain fallow for so long, felt like it was waking up. I loved the challenge, the clean logic of the equations, the satisfaction of a balanced ledger. The skills I had used in secret to dismantle an empire, I was now honing in the open. For myself, I decided to pursue the degree I had abandoned all those years ago. One snowy evening, I was studying at the kitchen table, my textbook spread out before me, when Leo came home from work. He stood in the door.